Hello, everybody. Today, I have with me the award-winning expert on the radical right, professor of ethnomusicology and international affairs at the University of Colorado Boulder. He has written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy, Los Angeles Review of Books, and the Atlantic. And he is the author of the new book, War for Eternity, inside Steve Bannon's circle of far-right, or I think I messed that up, inside Bannon's far-right circle of global power brokers. How are you doing this evening, Dr. Teitelbaum? Am I pronouncing that right?
Teitelbaum? Absolutely. Okay. And it's fine. The little botch of the subtitle of the American version of the book. That's not my favorite subtitle. So
yeah. I got the sense that the subtitle, it's supposed to like grab the person's attention in the bookstore, especially with the juxtaposed next to all the other books about all the stuff going on right now too. So
of course, I'm not sure that it would grab my attention, but I'm a bit of an oddball. So
yeah, when I picked it up, I thought it was just going to be about his more or less his impact on modern politics in general. I was not expecting to go down the rabbit hole that I ended up going through reading that book. So yeah,
it's really a book about ideas masquerading as a book about Bannon, and the actual subject of the book is really not a person. It's a set of ideas that have traveled through different social and political settings over time. So
precisely,
that excites me very much. But that's not a bestseller plot line.
Yeah, especially given the fact that the ideas you talk about didn't initially begin as like inherently political ideas in general.
Absolutely not.
Like Guanon, for instance, was not a particularly political individual. So, yeah.
Rejected politics outright. I mean, with some qualifications. At least that was his official stance, was that he rejected politics outright.
Yeah. But anyway, so tell me a bit about yourself and your background and your previous work.
So I consider myself a general scholar of the radical right. I think that any scholar of the radical right needs to be a music scholar as well, because for most of its post-war existence, it has not been an official political movement, or it's been a political movement in name only. It's rather been an aesthetic and a social cause, because mainstream political avenues have been off limits to it, of course. And that's I would dare say, if you get into the particulars, I think you can get to a place where you can say that that's unique for the radical right. The radical left, of course, is purged from various political discourses and is kept out of various governments, but not quite to the same extent. And it's still very much, even in the post-war years, post-Soviet Union, still entertained notions that it was a viable political force that could eventually realize its goals in the here and now in a formal way. The radical right hasn't always had that self-perception, so it's always turned to symbolic expression, extra governmental activism and things like that. And that's been my interest most of the time. It's been expressive forms and it's been ideologies. And if that has focused on music, I've been happy to do that. When it hasn't dealt with music, I'm also not going to limit myself in those instances either. So I've traveled with it as it has been more and less music, and also as it entered into politics, really just exploding across the world the past decade.
Yeah. Additionally, hold on a second. So tell me a bit about War for Eternity. What compelled you to write this book on this subject in particular?
It really a set of circumstances. When I was doing research for my first book in Sweden, I came across, I was very interested in like mapping the ideological terrain of the radical right, and because it's factionalized in some ways, not in others, but oftentimes ideology will have parallel the way people dress, the way they act, what political parties they affiliate with or do not affiliate with. And there was one like little wing of people who would call themselves radical traditionalists, and that bled into the radical right, even though it was part of something else as well. And there were plenty of traditionalists who were not involved in politics, let alone right-wing politics. But there was this one sector of kind of the right-wing milieu that was into this stuff. And I felt like their ideas had outside influence, given their numeric size in terms of the actual people, I mean. And so I thought they were interesting in that sense. They were heads of fairly successful intellectual publishers, media outlets online in some cases, but they weren't.
I think like Arctos, for instance, would probably be a good example. Yeah.
Arctos and this network of websites, blogs, even someone may know what Metapedia is, a sort of parallel to Wikipedia.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, it reminds me a lot of, I don't know if you know much about it. I don't want to go on a tangent referring to his work, but Unqualified Reservations, Curtis Yarvin's blog.
Oh, okay. Yes. Yeah.
I know he does. I don't know if he considers himself a traditionalist, and he doesn't necessarily fit into the alt-right camp. Like, you can't place him really in any of those camps, but kind of, I know he generally flirts with a lot of these ideas as well.
And I would say intellectually, almost methodologically, maybe socially, Curtis Yarvin would be somebody who I would place in that direction.
Yeah.
So anyways, I was interested in that when I was doing my initial research. I read all of their authors. As a teacher, because I teach courses on the radical right at University of Colorado, I would always bring out traditionalists just as, I don't want to say comic relief, but partially that in my class. We'd study right-wing populists in government and their rising political influence. We'd study militant neo-Nazis. And then the traditionalists were just this variation. And it was just to show, I just kind of liked having them around just to weird my students out a bit. We'd be going through all this stuff and I'd be like, I'd tell them, by the way, we haven't really read any of the works or gotten to know the Muslim converts.
Oh yeah,
in the radical right.
Exactly. Like Gunan and Lings and those guys.
Absolutely, and more. I mean, there are people active in, contemporary right-wing anti-immigrant, semi-white nationalist activists who are white European converts to Islam in their own way, or Sufists.
Interesting. Yeah.
So, I just thought that was. Oh yeah.
No. Continue what you were saying.
I thought that was peculiar, but it certainly wasn't relevant, right?
Okay.
In the sense that if were I a journalist, I would ever care about it. I just had it in the back pocket as a sort of gag. And when following Trump's election, some reports started to come about Steve Bannon, who people have been saying, oh, he's this real radical and he's a white nationalist. I tend to be on the more conservative side when assigning labels like that. So I was kind of wondering, well, what do we, who is this guy? Why are we calling him a white nationalist per se? And of course, the more you learned about him, you saw that he's sharing a lot of space with, Breitbart is consistently reporting positively about identitarians in Europe, which have a proximity to this.
Which is kind of strange, given the fact that, like, under so I've never been a reader of Breitbart, but Andrew Breitbart was a lot more moderate, like mainstream conservative, and then it seems like after he died, Bannon took over, just took a completely different direction with regards to like their politics.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think Bannon is genuinely of a different political breed than Andrew Breitbart.
Yeah,
is. I don't think it's all just a facade. I think he has a different ideological orientation. It's not he partners with Tea Party people, but he has a different base, and this is part of it. I think this is a big part of it.
So why the title War for Eternity?
So I start this book. I get deeper into Bannon's reading of an affiliation with traditionalism. And as I'm studying him, and this is after he had his rise and fall in the White House, I start to note also some other figures around the world who, like him, are sort of have been guru figures, thinkers described as masterminds behind a political leader. And those figures include Olavo de Carvalho in Brazil. And they include Aleksandr Dugin.
Bolsonaro's buddy, right?
Bolsonaro's guru, yes. And then Aleksandr Dugin, who's a fairly difficult to characterize, but a public intellectual in Russia with also some varying and unstable, but nonetheless, existing.
Yeah, we'll get to him later. I definitely have a question or two about him later on.
Sure.
But
now, Dugin, in one of his speeches, I had actually met Dugin before I wrote this book, before I had met Bannon. and he gave a talk in Sweden at a seminar put on by Arctos, more or less, and this traditionalist, right-wing traditionalist publisher. And one of the things he said is that we need to fight not for the past that has passed, but on behalf of eternity, something like that, the eternity that exists in traditional society. And so I was thinking, let's call the book War for Eternity. People will think that means everlasting war or something like that, and then they'll get into the book and they'll realize that these thinkers, what it actually means is that they're fighting on behalf of what they consider to be unchanging eternal values opposite the doctrine of progress.
Yes. So yeah, definitely in terms of you definitely see that in like Evola and folks like that. But
yes,
but
and not nostalgia either. It's a belief. Traditionalists, I don't know how deeply you want to get into this, but the figures that I'm talking about in their more doctrinaire incarnations, they don't really believe in time.
Oh no, it definitely
to a much less sense, and they don't really believe in history in the sense that modern liberals would.
And it definitely reminds me back to ancient India, about how they culturally there really was no concept of time, and to a lesser extent the Greco-Roman world too. Mm-hmm. There's that sort of idea of living in the moment, doing your duty, and more or less cultivating that sense of inner virtue and kind of facing the future based upon how you're living your life now, in a sense. So I guess that's and it reminds me of sort of that, there was a Oswald Spengler quote about, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He was a German historian, but talked about how in ancient Egypt, they remembered everything historically because it was a very historical society. But in ancient India, they remembered nothing. History was not a part of their keeping recorded history. That wasn't a concern for them.
Yes. I mean, and this is, a lot of historians of Hinduism, the early Aryans, which of course, don't let that raise a flag. That's a different concept of Aryan than the Nordic thing.
Exactly.
That society, the Vedic society, maybe would be a better way to put it. So we're not raising any red flags.
Yeah.
Yes, it was not as obsessed with record keeping as others. And one of the things, when René Guénon and the Traditionalists, when they talk about lost virtue, some of them have talked about the advent of writing as being a sign of lost virtue. And there's a different way to frame what we're talking about. I think it was
about. Ancient beliefs and modern superstitions. Lings, he talked about the evolution sort of speech, how speech itself was sacred, and sort of the coming of writing almost sort of started to dilute the spiritual importance of language, of ancient language.
And as a symbol of the fact that spiritual truths were not a living part of everyday life, that they were being lost, and writing suddenly becomes a technology of an archive, when archiving becomes inevitable.
So that actually does bring me on to the next question that I had. I was going to ask to tell me a little bit about perennial traditionalism for those in my audience who don't necessarily know who it is. You pretty much already answered that, but my question following up that was in regards to the traditionalist view of history, for the lack of a better way of saying it. Is it uniform? Do they strictly adhere to the ancient Indo-European dichotomy of the four ages, like you see with Hesiod and you see with the ancient Brahmin scholars, or do they simply take it as a basic template and apply it to different perspectives? And do they view it as being more literal or allegorical?
These are very tough questions to answer. And I should say first, because you're asking questions, you clearly have studied this, and I will give more nuanced responses than I would if I were just giving a radio interview.
Okay.
Bear in mind that when we talk about traditionalism, any spiritual, political, ideological community or school is going to have fuzzy boundaries. And boundaries, consistency among participants, adherents, devotees, can be aided if there is an actual organization, if people can be card-carrying members of the club, and traditionalism doesn't even have that. So it's very hard to talk about a standard traditionalist view or what is common among traditionalists. Having said that, certainly the early works of René Guénon have a sort of canonical status in this world, and there are people who think that there's a divine content to him and that he was divinely inspired himself. There are others who see him as simply giving a sort of roadmap guideline to the past. One thing that we can say about essentially all traditionalists that I've ever encountered is that they see time, to the extent it exists, as being a sort of cycle of decline.
Okay.
Right? That in the past there was some sort of golden age or some golden time or epoch, and as for most of human history, for most of our time on this earth, as time goes forward, we disintegrate from that status of spiritual purity and spiritual connectedness and wholeness, until we reach a breaking point and there is some sort of cataclysmic event and we are reset to that golden age, and then decline starts again.
Mm-hmm. So very Hindu.
Absolutely. I mean, but the way that they look at this is that Hinduism captured, actually, and preserved, incubated a deeper truth that predates and transcends Hinduism.
Yeah.
And that you see some of these ideas. I mean, you talked about a connection between Greco-Roman and Hindu society. The belief, of course, and this is not at all unfounded, that Hinduism is one of the most intact and integral traditions of the Indo-European world and the pre-monotheistic Indo-European world. And that's why you see connections between Hinduism and, say, the stuff that I'm used to teaching also in my university life, the Icelandic sagas and Norse mythology and things like that.
Yes.
So yeah. So just so that I get to your question, that basic concept that actually has a lot of consequences. It might seem very simple to say, okay, things used to be good and now they've been getting bad, and they're going to get really bad until it explodes, and then it's good again, and then it's going to start getting bad, and we're trapped in the cycle. The consequences is that you really, the notion of progress is going to be very foreign and offensive to you, if that's what you think the deeper truth of the world is. So that already kind of marks traditionalists, even though I know they're traditionalist figures who either reject politics or place themselves on a left progressive side of the spectrum. I think that there is some genetic orientation in traditionalist thinking that points toward an anti-progressive and therefore anti-liberal, anti-modernist political world. Whether or not you go into the details and say, okay, there are 4 ages, they each one exists for this amount of time. In this amount of time, they correspond to this particular caste hierarchy. Those are details that I see different figures emphasizing in different ways, and most particularly elaborating the details of what they think each stage in decline entails. The figures on the right are very tied to Julius Evola's interpretation of that, and the details that he put in, what he says takes place specifically as we find ourselves going through that cycle of birth, death, and rebirth.
Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit about the time that you spent shadowing Mr. Bannon. Like, how long did you spend following him around? What were your impressions of him as both a person and as a thinker?
So I spent about 2 years with him. As we were talking about, like 20 months or something like that. And then, of course, I've maintained contact with him more informally since then. But it's hard to do that, of course. He makes a big impression, I'd have to say. So I'm not a fellow traveler of his politically, and I never have been. And I don't think that I ever will be. So there was that divide, and that we weren't predestined to commiserate on politics, let's say.
Mm.
Even though I do break with kind of leftist dogma in a couple key ways, I still, I was never going to vote for his candidates or anything like that.
Yeah.
I also noticed right off the bat that there's a lot of vanity in him. Of course, there's a lot of moves.
It's almost like he sees himself as Kalki trying to bring an end to the Kali Yuga, or if he's sort of that like Carlylean great man type. He definitely has that sort of inflated way, at least from how I've seen it.
I mean, zoom out of those particulars. This is someone who has decided he he himself is of consequence to human history.
Mhm.
And he may be. I mean, for goodness sakes, he may be. But it's not lost on him, and he's eager to see that identity reinforced. So mixed in with that, and there's so much talk about him being a blowhard, and inflating himself and manipulating people and manipulating media, all of which is true. What struck me about him was at the same time, he was incredibly well read, very intelligent, curious, charismatic in his own way, personable, engaging. So it was a mix. It was a mix. When I started interviewing him and I started really seeing him frequently, and I started writing about him, of course, in the back of my mind there was this media discourse. It was a sort of genre of writing about Bannon, in the Washington Post and the Guardian, New York Times, and so forth. That was really just about chastising other writers and journalists from giving him space and time and taking him seriously. The main question, I think, for a lot of the intelligentsia when they read an article on Bannon is, are you calling him out as a phony / evil? Those two things are not entirely mutually reconcilable, but nonetheless, are you doing that, or are you being an apologist for him? And I hate dualisms like that. And the tricky thing for me was that I kind of saw evidence for everything involved in it. I saw evidence for taking him seriously and dismissing him at any given time.
Yeah. He other than a couple like third positions he seems to hold, he never really particularly struck me as being particularly quote unquote far right in the classical sense. In fact, he actually even appears to hold a number of beliefs that would traditionally be associated with the old left. He's like, I recall an episode of, I think it was Real Time with Bill Maher, where he was actually praising Bernie Sanders and implied that he was his second choice behind Donald Trump, which took me completely off guard. And he was criticizing the tax cuts. And I believe he was like really in favor of like a lot of the stimulus packages here right now with like COVID and everything. Is this consistent with your experiences with him?
Yes. Yeah. I don't think, I think he plays that up in certain and plays it down in certain media contexts, but yes. Yeah. I think his idea, and he's probably right about this, is that a Republican Party that was left-leaning on economics and right-leaning on social issues would be extremely powerful and very difficult for, let's say, the Democrats to stop.
That was almost like the platform that Trump ran back in 2016. He definitely governed a lot more traditionally. I don't want to call him a conservative, because Trump really isn't a conservative in like the Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan sense.
He's nothing, right?
Yeah, he doesn't really have an ideology. But either way, he definitely ran on that plot. Like on trade, he ran to the left of Hillary Clinton, who had the traditionally, who had the traditionally, Clinton had the traditionally like liberal free market, free trade view, whereas Donald Trump had that very mercantilist tariffs and almost like corporatist in a sense, which I'm sure was, I'd assume in a lot of ways was an influence of from Bannon.
I think so, or at least Bannon saw some of those tendencies and pushed them. I think, and there were little moments of paying lip service to more robust social safety nets. This was really 2016. You're right to isolate that to 2016 and not 2020. There was very little of that. 2020, the initial message was anti-socialism.
Yeah, because I think they were expecting Bernie to be the nominee, and then they were like, they did not expect basically all the other Democratic candidates to just drop out all at once and coalesce behind Biden
and throw it to Biden, which made it would have been very interesting to see what would have happened to that message, the socialist message, but. Nonetheless, that's where he wanted to be. I think he has genuine interest there. Where things are difficult and where I can strike a more sinister tone in chronicling his his thinking is that he regards the white working class in a specific way. It's not just the working class. It is. He spoke, and I did a brief little discourse analysis on this in the book, just based on with the material being my interviews with him. That when he spoke about the white working class, he was referring to ambassadors for America writ large.
Yeah.
He talked about other working classes. They were kind of the private concerns of a minority group. So the white working class has a particular metaphysical status for him in his understanding of Americanness that other working classes do not have.
That's interesting. Because I've always seen sort of the American Revolution as almost a revolution of the middle class in a lot of respects. Like,
yes. Exactly.
Kind of like I mean, I don't subscribe to Marx's theory of history or dialectical materialism in general, but you definitely saw, like Marx talked about the revolution of the proletariat, and before then the decline of feudalism was the revolution of the bourgeois, which would be like the French Revolution, the American Revolution. So that is really interesting that he sees just the historical metaphysical basis of the American spirit of like the Weltgeist, quote unquote, to be like the white working class in particular.
Yes. I mean, it's, and he justifies this in a number of ways, but the one that was most relevant and interesting to me was that he said that they're not modernists.
Okay.
Right.
That definitely sounds like a very Bannon thing to say.
It does. And you could, see a sort of, I don't want to connect that to traditionalism really, but it's where traditionalism could potentially have some overlap with standard, Johan Gottfried von Hede nationalism, where, the rural peasantry, women, children, were all seen as repositories of, the pre-modern essence of the folk or the nation, precisely because they were excluded from modernization and cosmopolitanism, opposite, urbanites, highly educated men, educated minorities, things of that nature.
I've noticed that. So yeah, reading your book was very enlightening, and it really helped paint a picture of Mr. Bannon that I'd never considered before, and I'm sure a lot of other readers of your book never considered before either. But the media still seems to paint him out as your typical right-wing radical, and in some cases even like a white nationalist or right nationalist adjacent. How accurate would you say that this characterization is? And do you think that there's certain things to him and his ultimate agenda that the media gets wrong or deeply misconstrues?
Well, I do not think that he has some explicit ideology of promoting whiteness and white people. Maybe whiteness might be, put that on the back burner. There could be something to it. But so to me, he's not a white nationalist. He has shared space with them, made common cause with them, but I don't call him that. And I don't call him a neo-Nazi either, even though despite his very peculiar fascination with Leni Riefenstahl, he, for a lot of people, a lot of commentators, and if you hear irritation in my voice, it's because I'm really tired of having the argument with these people. Calling someone a white nationalist or fascist is really just a way of saying, okay, they're on the right and they're really, really bad.
Yeah.
And if you don't call them one of those things, then necessarily what you've done is kind of moved them away from the edge of the scale and toward the center in some way, and you've paid them a compliment. So when I don't call him a fascist, a neo-Nazi, a white nationalist, it's based on particulars of his ideology and his past, the thinking that he not only consumes but also celebrates, but has had as the basis for his social life, organization, networking, and so on. And this right-wing brand of traditionalism, there's a case to be made. If you ask Julius Evola, it's to the right of fascism.
Oh yeah, what was it he said? He's like, I'm not a fascist, I'm a super fascist.
Yes.
Yeah.
About various particular things, but he's written it's a collection of essays called Fascism Viewed from the Right. So I correct people. I I argue that case, that that I would call him some brand of traditionalist, traditionalist inspired, traditionalist affiliate, something like that. And that might sound like you are involved in apologetics, but I'm not sure that it is. So calling him a fascist or a white nationalist is just inaccurate. It
seems very not just reductive, but yeah, inaccurate, especially if you're trying to get to the heart of what he actually believes, which is what your book does.
If you care about that stuff, and if you don't care about that stuff, fine. But at the very least, you don't get to call yourself a scholar of the radical right. And if you want to be a political operative or an opinion journalist, I can see why somebody would do that. Otherwise, I can't.
So in your book, you also talk about a lot of your off-the-record conversations with Mr. Bannon on the subject of his intellectual journey. So he's definitely a big reader, a bookworm, particularly when it comes to more obscure books on history, philosophy, comparative religions. But other than the thinkers such as Evola and Guénon that you've mentioned, are there any others, any other books, any other thinkers that have, as far as you know, inspired his philosophy and his outlook?
Certainly. I mean, Heidegger, for one.
Oh, yep.
Even though I've never really discussed him in depth with Bannon. Gurdjieff, absolutely. Gosh, those are the, in terms of big philosophers, those are the ones. I mean, he certainly talks about Thomas Aquinas quite a bit.
I've never watched any of his films, but I've seen snippets and videos that people have done covering it. I almost get a sense, like, I definitely get some strong Strauss-Howe generational theory vibes from him too.
I would have loved to have asked him about Strauss. I've never had the chance to do it. We talked about Ernst Jünger a little bit.
Okay. Yeah. Storm of Steel. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, and that was more the texts that he read, which is not one of Junger's most philosophical texts.
No, it's an autobiography.
Yeah. It's almost journalistic in a way. I was hoping that he would have read the Forest Passage and we could have had a conversation about that.
Okay.
I would have been very, very keen to hear him talk about, because that one relates, in my mind, more to, let's say, Ride the Tiger by Julius Evola.
Okay.
So, but just mentioning those thinkers, Heidegger, Strauss, less so Thomas Aquinas, but Gurdjieff, those who are not traditionalists can still broadly be kind of viewed in the same territory. Heidegger, like Nietzsche, can just spread everywhere, of course.
Oh yeah, kind of like Hegel too would be another good example of that. Yeah.
Although it's telling to me that I've never heard him say much positive about Hegel.
Yeah.
And Hegel is fundamentally different from, let's say, Guénon and Evola. There's a
definitely
at a very, very basic genetic level.
Hegel definitely would be closer to someone like, I think, like Voltaire in a lot of respects. Yeah. Mm-hmm. He's like, I've read both of their books. Like, Voltaire wrote his philosophy of history. Hegel did too, going down like all the different ancient civilizations, about just their general theories about the movement of history. Definitely very linear in their thinking too.
Exactly. Yep. That's it. I mean, all the other details aside, that key difference is enough to really separate them, I think. But Gurdjieff was a striking figure in all of this, and it's telling to me. I could never really confirm when he discovered Guénon, and when he had read, he was very. I mean, he could just name drop René Guénon's text. This key tradition.
Yeah, you mentioned that.
And he knew a lot of them. He knew some of the hard ones. East and West are pretty darn. That's
yeah. I have that one sitting next to me, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Those that's hard, man. And his becoming according to the Vedanta. That's not something you just plop down on an airplane and read.
No, I've definitely had to read it like a page a day. It's a lot to take in.
It's really hard to do, and it's hard to read a page a day. You have to almost, because you'll lose your train of thought with it. It's difficult. But anyways, I don't know, is it a gimmick? Because Bannon's life, if you look at his biography, he's done so many different things. He's had that's the story of his success, really, has just been a scattershot of initiatives, most of which failed, and then every now and then one goes through. And I pondered the question when I was working on this: is traditionalism?
Sorry to interrupt for a second, but didn't he like revolutionize gold farming or something like with World of Warcraft and all that?
Ooh, I wouldn't be able. I'm not expert in it. In order to
okay, I heard it somewhere. I forget where, but yeah.
I mean, that's one of his initiatives.
Yeah.
That most definitely. But I pondered whether or not traditionalism was just one of these flavor of the month things for him that he just moves through. Kind of his carousel of ideas, and I couldn't confirm when he discovered Guénon. He said he'd read Guénon's text for a long time. He read Huxley's
Perennial work. Yeah. I have that one here too.
Okay. And Guénon is recommended in that. He knew that, so maybe that's a much more widely read text. Maybe that's when he first came across Guénon. But
what about Joseph Campbell? Did he ever mention him?
No. But Gurdjieff, I know and was able to confirm that at least in the early 90s, he was not only reading Gurdjieff, but he was socializing with communities of Gurdjieff followers in California. High-ranking ones. And when I learned that, and then I start to piece together, okay, later on, 2010s at the very latest, he's finding Evola and is pretty taken by Evola too.
Well, so that was pretty late then when he found Evola.
I think it was late. I mean, I think his enthusiasm for Evola was that it brought together right-wing politics with
traditionalism,
spirituality, and stuff. That Gurdjieff isn't a traditionalist, but he's out there, and it made learning about Gurdjieff and following that history highlighted the fact to me that this is long-standing. This is longer-standing. The interest in alternative spirituality has been a more stable fixture of his life than right-wing politics, even.
Okay, so that actually does bring me on to the next question I have. Like, how honest do you think that Mr. Bannon is in his traditionalism and commitment to his supposedly anti-materialist mindset? Like, in many ways, he appears to contradict some of his positions. Most obvious would be Bannon's rampant populism and hatred of what the late James Burnham would call the managerial elite. Yet at the same time, people like Guénon and Evola especially were elitists who believed that mass democracy only enabled sort of a dictatorship of the voter, or Caesarism, to put it in the words of like Weber.
Yeah. I would call him, I mean, we could say there's so many ways in which he's hypocritical. You could call him the man himself. He's, this is the populist who zips around, who has houses everywhere and zips around on a private jet. And I would call him a hypocrite, except we're all hypocrites.
Oh yeah, totally.
and the traditionalists, I mean, the organizational infrastructure such as it was that existed, especially after the death of Guénon, and people following Fridtjof Schoen and Gurdjieff as well, his schools that went on, a lot of them were plain old brackets, highly materialist. They were sex cults and money making machines.
Exactly.
That's not true of everyone involved in it, and I certainly don't want to smear and tar them. And if it were to seem like I was going to smear and tar traditionalists, I would expand it beyond that to say everyone.
Hey, no, me too. Like, for instance, I definitely share, I wouldn't necessarily call myself a traditionalist, but I definitely share a lot of their beliefs in terms of modernity. Yet at the same time, I am a big fan of Milton Friedman and F.A. Hayek and those guys, which they're like, liberalism is like the most materialistic you could get ideologically.
And one could say that, yes, there are the pure traditionalists who joined the Sufi tariqas and could trace themselves through lineage to Schoen, to Guénon, and all that stuff. But for a lot of people in that world, their traditionalism is kind of like what you just described. They read lots of stuff, and this is, kind of their anchor to more eccentric, more esoteric teaching. And is kind of a token of the fact that they are skeptical of progress and modernity.
Mm-hmm. sorry.
And they can recombine that. There are no rules to this. I really, it could be because I'm coming more from anthropology rather than intellectual history, but I'm pretty agnostic in assigning labels and calling people, wanting to be the adjudicator of saying you're on the team or you're in the club and you're not. The actual life, the phenomenal life of traditionalism has been one of hybridity and selective adoption of teachings and, strategic and convenient recombination. So,
yeah. And again, that also, I like how this conversation's going, because I ordered my questions in a pretty random way, and it seems like each thing you're saying gets closer and closer to the next thing I was going to ask. But
we planned this, right?
But other ideological contradictions I've noticed are how Bannon himself is a devout Roman Catholic and a devotee, yet he's also a devotee to the philosophy of Julius Evola, who was himself a staunch anti-Christian and a particularly anti-Catholic, which is something that runs counter to the conventional view of Christianity held by most traditionalist thinkers, who they tend to be like critical of the Reformation and advocate for Western civilization's return to traditional forms of Christianity like medieval Catholicism, Orthodoxy, High Church Anglicanism. But where Bannon seems to want to fight against modernity and reverse the clock to a previous age, a majority of the perennialist thinkers appear, from at least my experience reading them, advocated almost for embracing modernity, as they thought that fighting it would only perpetuate the Kali Yuga. Especially like you had Martin Lings, who was generally politically moderate and even center left in his politics, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. And then also finally another contradiction. Bannon is heavily critical of Islam and Islamic immigration, but nearly like half of the traditionalists were themselves Sufi converts.
Yes. The details and everything that you just mentioned matter a lot, though. Let's start. Can I take them in reverse order?
Yes. I probably should have asked that question in smaller bits. So
he's critical of Islam, but not Sufism. And we talk about this a little bit in the book, and I may have put this in a footnote, though. He said to me once, we were in this kind of biker barbecue bar in Tucson, and we were sitting, it was a great scene because there are all these, really rough kind of, types who just, they recognize them, they love them, they're giving them beers and stuff. And, he turns to me and said, man, if we could just convert the Middle East to Sufism, we'd have no problem. So we're having that conversation as everything else is spinning around. But I've also asked him before, could you ever have seen yourself, could you have converted to Sufism? And that question kind of stumped him, at least more so than you might expect. And he kind of waffled and contorts his face. And then he says to me, well, it just wasn't my path. I wasn't raised in it. That's his aversion to Sufism.
Okay.
Let that be the introduction to the Catholic issue. So he is a devout Catholic. If you ask him also, are you a devout Catholic? A Catholic? No hesitation. Yes, of course.
Is he like a latrine mass type, like pre-Vatican II?
I've never gotten into those details with him. I'm sure someone else has, but I would assume so. Yes.
Okay.
He'll call himself a traditionalist Catholic, lowercase t.
Yeah.
In this context. And so that's where officially he is. When we're talking about traditionalism, he'll always stop to reassure me, no, I don't believe in syncretism, right? Or hybridity, because that's heresy and that's outlawed by the church, and that's why he doesn't believe in it.
Okay.
That's different from actually saying I don't believe in it.
So where does Evola play into this? Like, he definitely seems to really like Evola, but Evola hated Christianity.
Well, hold on a sec, because he also, the more that I've talked to him, he will say all those things about Catholicism, and then he will say, Christianity starts before Christ. He will pick up some of those older teachings. He will say things. We will be talking about the linearity of Christianity, which is one of the complaints that comes from Evola. And he'll say, you know what? I don't really buy that. I don't really believe that.
I know, like, in a lot of ways, modern Christianity is adopted from a lot of different, like, so in a sense, I don't want to call it syncretism, but in a lot of ways it is, in the sense that all of these traditions kind of came together in this particular direction. Like, a lot of modern Christianity, it takes the theology and the moral teachings of Christ and then merges it with Greco-Roman metaphysics.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. The distinction is how do we present it? Because most Christians do not say that, right?
Yeah.
And most Christians with the pagan roots of a lot of Catholic ritual and the holiday celebration.
Yeah. No, it was pretty brilliant too. Like, I mean, you had the missionaries going out, and they were able to find like all these different traditions and ideas that were already within these cultures, and were able to find a way to make them Christian it made it easier for like, it was more attractive to converts. Like,
this was the evangelist. I mean, that was the way it works. I mean, but still a lot of Christians of any denomination or incarnation are going to be very threatened and bothered by that notion, that Christ would not be the sole source of their faith. Bannon is not one of those. So here's a couple things. So we already know, he would see other faiths as being legitimate paths towards something bigger, presumably even than Christianity in this case. Does not believe in linear time. That seems so essential to Christianity and its eschatology.
yes.
Celebrates the pagan, extra Christian roots of a lot of Christian practices, which is one reason why a lot of capital T traditionalists who still adhere to Christianity, they'll either embrace the Eastern Orthodox Church, but if they don't do that, they are oftentimes Catholic.
Yeah, I've noticed like all the ones I've met, like I have never met, with an exception of Anglicans, I have never met a traditionalist who was Protestant.
No, that's right. I've never met one either.
Yeah.
And that could be that they're just the embrace of Catholicism could just be like your embrace of Milton Friedman. Just, no, it doesn't make sense, but this is just how things work to me. Or in some cases, there is a deeper ideological explanation, which is that the value of Catholicism is its transcendence of Christianity.
Yeah.
And
you definitely see that with Christian esotericism in the Middle Age. Like, I've always said that medieval Christianity, they have the Middle Ages produced better theologians, more complex theologians than today in a lot of ways. Because
there's a dynamism to it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
In a way, almost like that's why I don't like the term Dark Ages, because they were very open-minded in terms of a lot of their intellectual pursuits back in like the 13th, 14th century.
I think when we hear Dark Ages, we think Puritanism.
Yeah.
Of a more recent variation that we're familiar with and know more about. But yeah, absolutely. But all this is to say is that, yes, Bannon is a Catholic, but if we just say that, that is not a rebuttal or a refutation of anything. I had one review of the book in the European Conservative where that was kind of foisted as someone had gotten the inside scoop that Bannon was a devout Catholic, and that kind of disproved my my book, and it really doesn't work that way. If you look at Evola's specific criticisms of Christianity, and especially kind of post-Evolian right, what they took out of it, it was its linearity, its progress, its universalism. Bannon also, by the way, does not like evangelism. He just said that as an offhand comment to me. He doesn't like Christian evangelism.
Yeah.
He's Catholic while embracing all of these features that inspired others to dislike Christianity, and also recognizing a sort of universalism that transcends Christianity. Christianity would just be one of multiple paths towards something that is bigger than it.
So yeah, but also, so to take this away from Bannon, you also met with a number of other traditionalist figures involved in world politics, like Aleksandr Dugin. Could you describe your experience interviewing them? I know it was more limited than Bannon, but just in general, just briefly, could you go over like what your experience with them was, and where maybe they differ from Bannon, their ultimate agendas, where they kind of converge, that sort of thing?
So, and I'll stick to the two big figures, Aleksandr Dugin and Olavo de Carvalho. I also followed a fourth strain, kind of with people with less influence. But Aleksandr Dugin is this public intellectual in Russia. He floats in and out of influence, both within Russia and abroad, as a sort of philosopher agent of Russia. And as I said, I'd met him before. I also, from my years of field work with the radical right, had a lot of intermediaries with him. So by the time I got to him, it was, he was willing to speak to me, but he did not want to speak about details with me. At first, he would not talk at all. And while I was writing the book, he would not talk at all to me about what I learned was a secret meeting between him and Bannon in 2018.
Was that the one at the Vatican?
In Rome.
Oh, okay.
Yep, actually, just a few blocks away from Julius Evola's old flat. And our conversations are fascinating. He's a very difficult interview, and I'm not a journalist, so I don't like doing those formal interviews. I like to do them to start off with, and then ideally you start to be able to spend informal time and have informal conversations. That's when you learn more about somebody, I've always thought.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's generally what I like to do too. However, we only have an hour, so that's why I prepared the questions. So
no, there's value to all that. It's just the type of work that I do isn't really geared toward that. But he's always fascinating. He gave me insight, even though he wouldn't admit to actually having met Bannon face to face. He gave me insight into the discussions that they had, which was a debate about really the metaphysical status of the United States, Americanness, Russia, and China, and second to a lesser extent Iran. But their key disagreement was really where the source and the hub of modernism and liberalism is to be found today in the world. And Dugin's dogma for many years, and it has seeped out, I think it's common sense to a lot of traditionalists on the right, is that the United States and the West are the source of liberalism, homogeneity, progress, universalism, all of these things that he believes are counter to the teachings of
which ironically have their roots in Christianity.
Yes. I think Alain de Benoit, if you're looking for a rightist take on how that all fits with Christianity, offers some. Tomislav Sunic as well. So that's where a lot of my conversations with Dugin were focusing on, and they were very much the same disagreements that he had with Olavo de Carvalho, who I think inspired Bannon's pseudo-traditionalist, semi-traditionalist, I should say, Geopolitics. Olavo de Carvalho is an exceptionally complicated figure. He has a fascinating biography. Today, he officially distances himself from the Traditionalist school. I have some critical thoughts about that, but be that as it may, he's, of the three, the one who today is least likely to affiliate himself with traditionalism, but his biography is the most formally traditionalist. He was initiated into the Tariqa of Fridtjof Schon. So if there are card-carrying traditionalists, he would have been one of them once upon a time.
Okay.
More so than the other two, certainly more so than Dugin or Bannon.
So, but with Dugin, would this be an appropriate way to sort of sum up his view? Because he's very, very, he's a Russian nationalist, more or less. I know at one point he was basically a Nazbol. But yeah, so like kind of like a synthesis of far right, far left politics. But in a lot of ways, from the very little I've read about him, it's almost as if he sees Russia, he sort of sees this Eurasian civilization in its infancy that's trying to like break out of this Western mold that has been imposed upon Russia ever since the days of like Peter the Great. Would that be an accurate way of describing his sort of view of history, Russian history?
Yes. He would tell you, though, that Russia and Russian nationalism is actually a tool to a deeper end.
Okay.
So in that what Russia and Eurasia symbolize, and what they embody, rather, would be the more accurate term, is tradition, opposite modernity. And he even thinks, and he pulled together these ideas, but he thinks that the geographic features of Russia are part of the reason for this. The fact that Russia is bounded in a landmass, is not coastal, is more stationary,
okay,
less fluid. That it has lended its society. It's given that geographic feature has implanted a value for wholeness and stability, continuity, opposite renegade individualism, change, and progress, which are values for the coastal Atlantic states. And and he'll talk about the United States. as embodying that in its geography as well, that in the center of the country, probably not in my Snow Peak region here in Colorado, we're this blue island, but the rest of the interior of the United States
Yeah.
has a greater value for continuity opposite the coasts.
Do you think that plays in maybe to Bannon's view of like the white working class too? Because you see them like in the flyover states, and like that's why he thinks that sort of they're the future of the West.
Well, it's probably one way that he also connects with Dugin, yes. And I never really got to have that particular discussion with him, but we see the commonality here in that, it's not just saying that, oh yeah, the white working class is cool and I like them and they don't use funny pronouns, so they're awesome. But no, it's this.
That seems like definitely more than just the everyday Trump supporter view right there. Yeah.
Supporter. Whereas, Bannon says they're not modernists. And Dugin has an explanation for them not being modernists. It's because of where they are and that they're not involved in this cult of progress, as he would see it.
Okay.
That's what Russian nationalism is for him, though. It's a tool in his mind. It's a very convenient tool, being a Russian, right? But it's a tool to fight back against the United States and the Atlantic states, and it is just the tip of the iceberg in a deeper collision between tradition and modernity.
So, but back to Bannon, what would you say the breadth of his influences on modern politics in general? Because some people I've seen seem to like inflate him as like, oh, he's this like huge threat to the entire world. I'm sure that inflates his ego too. But then a lot of other people are like, oh no, he's just fringe and this is not a big deal. Like, what truly is the breadth of his influence on politics in the contemporary era?
I have a hard time answering that question, and in part it's not actually the question that I've been interested in exploring. Okay. I've been more interested in him as an interpreter than an agent, than an actor. I mean, I don't when I hear people say, having said that, take that as as an opening throat clearing. Having said that, if I hear people say that he is completely without influence, I wonder about Charlottesville. I wonder about Trump's response to Charlottesville.
Yeah.
Which emboldened a lot, of course, even just a slight change in tone from the status quo of U.S. presidents and U.S.
You can even apply it to what happened on the 6th. Back too with the White House siege or assault, or I wouldn't call it a coup. I'd call it definitely an attempted insurrection. But
an attempted insurrection. It's tough. I go back and forth between wanting to under and overplay it. Yeah, not wanting to under or overplay it. We have that. We have a seat on the National Security Council. I'm not willing to see that relativized into nothingness.
Okay.
He was on that council for a short period of time. But that's more formal political influence than anyone I've ever been around and ever will be around, probably. Yeah. There's a reason why the opponents of Trump were so up in arms about that. That's a powerful position. That's more powerful than him just being a strategic advisor, which is what he was earlier.
And Trump quite literally made up a new position just for Bannon specifically.
Campaign CEO, yes,
or the chief strategist. No, like once he got into the White House, the chief strategist.
Yeah. I mean, all of that. Is more people. I heard people say, oh, he's no way is he more influential than Alain de Benoit or Guillaume Fay or these other kind of thinkers on the fringe right. And I see some examples of that, but I can't. The things that we've just been talking about, I can't just wash that away. That's really significant. I will say this. I think that Olavo de Carvalho is the one who undoubtedly has the most influence.
How so?
And it's striking because he's the one who has not had any official assignments.
I don't know very much about him at all. Like I never even heard of him until I read your book. Yeah. And I still you can't find much about him online either.
No, he refused a position in the Bolsonaro government. Okay. Recommended other people though who are followers, devotees, or fellow travelers of his who are sitting in the government right now. He himself described the current foreign minister of Brazil, Ernesto Araújo, as being, quote, more of a traditionalist than I am. And I think that's certainly true today. Araujo is one who can quote well, accurately, the writings of Dugin, Guénon, and Evola, and that's the acting foreign minister.
Okay.
And that's their Mike Pompeo. But Olavo is a massive social media figure.
Interesting.
An influencer guru, something of a journalist, something of an intellectual, a writer. He's written a lot of books. He has a school, and his students are genuinely gripped by him. And some of them are really devout followers of his. And the president of Brazil is absolutely devout follower. He received a medal, something akin to Rush Limbaugh's, if here. I forget if it was the Medal of Freedom or something.
I think it was Presidential Medal of Freedom. Yeah.
Presidential Medal of Freedom, right. Olavo got the equivalent in Brazil. He started fights with so many members of the cabinet, including the president's vice president, Mauro, is the guy's name, I believe. And the president took his side. And the president's sons took Olavo's side against his own vice president, and the generals have had meetings about it. He stirs up a lot. He really is an agent of chaos there, it must be said, but there's no discussion like there is about Bannon right now or Dugin in past years, mainly in scholarly circles, saying that, oh, he's really not influential. Everyone knows he's influential.
Yeah.
He has the president's ear in ways that most people don't. So,
but moving on from the topic of, since we're a bit short for time. Yeah. So, but moving on just for the last couple minutes, moving on from the topic of Steve Bannon and traditionalism entirely. You're an ethnomusicologist. Many philosophers of history have described music, at least as we know it, as the most spiritually significant art form in Western civilization, similar to how like the sculpture was in ancient Greece. How accurate would you say that this characterization is as an expert on the subject?
I'm not an expert on that topic, but I'm almost more speaking as a private person, but I 100% agree. One way I suppose that I've been able to find some common ground with traditionalists is that I think that the amazing thing about music is that you can reckon and quantify it in material terms. People say that music is an immaterial art form. That's not actually true. It's that there's physicality to the instruments that produce it.
Like for instance, I'd even argue that. So a lot of people say that Tolkien started the fantasy genre. I'd argue it was Wagner.
Interesting in that sense.
Yeah. And it's really.
I'm actually speaking in a more elementary level here. That
okay.
You can combine these tones. You may know what they are individually. We can combine, the three notes of a major triad, let's say, quantify them, and you will not at all be talking about music. It is that mystical space where its elements and its materialities interact with each other, and that's an immaterial space.
Yeah, I'd say especially like Western music, especially beginning with classical music, it's almost like you're hearing the sound of infinity, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. In a lot of ways, like it's like really multi-layered, almost in a infinitesimal direction. So you could hear that from like everything like Mozart all the way to Pink Floyd, I'd say.
Well, yes. I mean, it's at the very least, I think we could say that it escapes a lot of description. Right? One of my favorite topics as a musicologist right now is vocable singing, is the phenomenon of singing without words, la la la, do 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 stuff. Which is a very widespread phenomenon. It has, and in many cases, there's some people who say that's just nonsense. Most often, most music cultures, it's the opposite of nonsense. It's like speaking in tongues. It's the type of music making that is more communicative than words, that transcends words, but does so in ways that we can't quantify or rationalize. That's mysterious. That's special, and it's certainly worth celebrating. So absolutely, if that's what spirituality is, if it exists in that territory, then I can absolutely concur with the historians you were talking about.
Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Teitelbaum. I know we went a little bit over an hour, But I really appreciate your coming on. Again, everybody, War for Eternity, Inside Bannon's Far-Right Circle of Global Power Brokers. It is available at your local brick-and-mortar bookstores. Remember, support brick-and-mortar bookstores. Only go to Amazon if you have to. So that's, yeah. But anyway, yeah, again, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you coming on here. It was a real treat having you on.
A pleasure, and thank you for those fantastic questions.
No problem. You have a great evening, Dr. Teitelbaum.
You too. You too. Take care.